I've recently been reviewing a lot of older cameras, but I've still yet to find a camera that I would happily consider using as an everyday carry-along. Well, I hadn't until I found this. This is the Fujifilm X10, and it's the much smaller and also much older relative to the very popular Fujifilm X100V. Now, it should be immediately obvious why this qualifies as a suitable everyday carry camera, because just look at it. This thing is so tiny and it weighs just about nothing. But besides its small form factor, what makes this camera from 2011 just so desirable in 2023? Well, I guess one thing would be its looks, because just like most Fujifilm cameras, this X10 has all of that vintage charm and top tier build quality that we've come to expect. In fact, when I first came across this camera, I actually thought it looked like a baby X Pro, despite the fact that this camera actually predates the original X Pro 1 by about a year. Though sadly, unlike the X Pro 1, this is just a very simple tunnel style viewfinder, and although part of me does admittedly love the very simplistic nature of it, particularly as it's rather considerate and it zooms in and out with your focal length, it can be a little tricky to use as there's absolutely no heads-up display of any kind. So I do admit that 99% of the time I do find myself just resorting to using the 2.8-inch screen on the back to compose most of my shots, which works absolutely fine. Now, speaking of the lens, you can't really miss this thing because it also doubles as the means of turning the camera on, which I think is a pretty cool little feature. This mechanical zoom is arguably one of the most considerate lenses that I've seen on a compact camera, and it offers an equivalent focal range of 28 to 112 millimeters, which is such a versatile range, particularly for street photography. It also has a fast variable maximum aperture of f2 to 2.8 and optical image stabilization to boot, which in my opinion is just a dream combo. Although I haven't used it all that much, there is a macro and super macro mode that allows you to take photos as close as 1 centimeter from your subject. But arguably the most unique thing about this camera is what sits behind the lens, as this sensor is unlike most of the modern X-Trans chips that we're used to seeing today. Firstly, it uses a 2/3-inch type sensor, which actually made it around twice as large as those used in almost all other competing compacts that were released around the same time as this camera. And gents, I think it's fair to say that we all know that every fraction of an inch really does count. But also, this was one of Fujifilm's newly developed EXR sensors, which was short for Extended Dynamic Range. And yes, if you think about it too much, that is a terrible acronym, but it looks cool, alright? And in a nutshell, there are 3 EXR modes. There's HR, which is basically just the default mode and creates images at the full 12 megapixel resolution. DR, or Dynamic Range, captures images with a greater dynamic range. And finally, SN, which stands for Signal to Noise, helps to create less noisy images at higher ISOs. However, the slight caveat to all of that is that the EXR mode can only output in JPEG, and both the latter DR and SN modes only allow for 6 megapixel images. On a side note, if you've ever experimented with film simulation modes on Fujifilm cameras before, then you will know that there is a setting in the camera that allows you to adjust the dynamic range setting from a base level of 100 all the way up to the maximum of 400. Now, doing this will help to increase the dynamic range in your photos, like retaining shadow and highlight details, and it's obviously intended to help the photos feel a little bit more like film would. This does come at the cost of not being able to drop the base ISO sensitivity below 400, at least when you're at the max setting, which can cause issues when shooting bright sunlight, particularly with a wide maximum aperture. But what's interesting is that when you set it to DR mode, you can set the same level of dynamic range as you would using the previous method, but whilst keeping the base ISO at 100. Sure, this will half your resolution to 6 megapixels, but honestly, for posting online, that's still plenty big enough. Would I use that setting all of the time? No, but having the flexibility to be able to lower the ISO whilst maintaining dynamic range in bright lighting conditions, that's a win for me. Now, speaking of film simulation modes, this camera obviously does have access to those too, albeit a much more limited selection than you're probably used to seeing on the more modern releases. But nonetheless, they're still pretty fun to experiment with, and you can gain some really good results straight out of the camera if you just want to minimize the amount of editing required and focus entirely on the art of photography. Alternatively though, this camera can still shoot in RAW, so if you do happen to enjoy post-processing, it's still able to give you the maximum amount of flexibility.
Target acquired.
Oh, sorry.
I didn't want to get in.
No, you're okay. For such a small camera, it's surprisingly comfortable to hold, though I do admit that I have managed to improve on this slightly by adding this Hotshoe thumbs up grip, which provides just an added bit of purchase. I've also added this soft shutter release, which I commandeered from my X Pro 2, but this actually makes it a lot easier to locate the shutter button just by touch alone. As always, I'll leave links in the description if anyone is interested in these two items. One thing in particular I think Fujifilm have really gotten right with this design of camera is just the button layout. All of the shortcuts you would ever need are easily accessible via via the camera body, which is really nice because it means you don't have to spend too much time diving through the settings menu on the screen to find what you need. Although there are no physical dials for things like shutter speed or ISO, most likely due to the limitations of its small frame, it does at least have 2 command dials, one near the rear thumb rest and one around the D-pad. There is also a customizable function button on the top plate here, which I ended up using as a quick access to ISO. All of that said, I would definitely be lying to you if I said that this camera was completely without flaws, and the most common issue that I just kept running into was its speed, or distinct lack of. Now, don't get me wrong, it's certainly not the slowest camera I have ever used, but if you happen to be a quick pace kind of shooter, then you are going to need to adopt some patience to work with this thing. For example, there's a slight but very consistent delay when locking on the focus, which does cause the screen to freeze for a fraction of a second, making the camera go temporarily blind. What makes this slightly worse is that when you do finally fully depress the shutter button, there is yet another delay between you thinking you've taken the photo and the photo actually being recorded, and this can make it slightly trickier to time shots perfectly. However, I will admit that although this was slightly frustrating to start with, after shooting with this camera for a couple of hours, you do just instinctively get used to it and you almost stop noticing it quite as much, or at least I did. One final thing to moan about is that the write speeds are fairly slow, particularly if you do like to shoot in both RAW and JPEG at the same time. But honestly, this isn't the kind of camera where you should expect to be able to rattle off hundreds and hundreds of shots in quick succession. It has a much slower pace to it, which is actually one of the things that I like about it so much. It forces you to really think about the shot you want to get and how you're going to capture it, which honestly is part of the challenge of photography that often gets lost by using modern, super fast cameras. The AF is actually fairly reliable, and despite there being no joystick, moving the active AF point around is pretty quick thanks to this dedicated AF button that grants you quick access. Moaning aside, none of these little gripes really take away from the charm and fun that this tiny camera offers. However, I actually think the biggest tragedy about this entire camera is the one thing that it has absolutely no control over, which is its current price. In the US, this camera can sell on eBay for anywhere between $300 and $500, which for a camera of this age and caliber is pretty pricey. Somewhat luckily for me, here in the UK, the used camera market offers a slightly more favourable price, and I was able to buy this camera from mpb.com for around 240 quid, which equates to a little over $300. As much as I love this camera and I'm happy that I bought it, I still think that's on the expensive side. On a complete side note, just a pre-warning to you that if you do happen to search for this camera on eBay, for example, please make sure that you take the time to type the full name, Fujifilm X10, put that into the search bar. Do not be lazy like I was and just type X10 expecting for it to show up, because otherwise, yeah, you're going to get something that's definitely not this camera. But anyway, after I'd finished looking at that for a little while, I did come across a few other YouTube videos from a few years back claiming that they were managing to pick this camera up for around $100, which I think is way more reasonable. So my hope is that once the whole Fujifilm hype eventually dies down a little bit and prices do become a bit more reasonable, more people will be able to buy and enjoy this magical little camera.